our planet Earth, sometimes blue, sometimes green, but there were periods in history when this entire world had turned into a frozen desert. 5 times yes, exactly 5 times yes, exactly 5 times yes, when every direction was covered only with ice. These were the great ice ages, lasting not hundreds, but thousands of years. Among these ice ages was the last one, the time when humans lived in caves, hunted in small groups, and fought for survival. During this last ice age, around 20 to 25,000 years ago, a group of hunters set out from the frozen plains of Siberia, winds blowing clouds of snow, broken cliffs, shrubs buried under ice. And somewhere along these paths, these people lost their way. They had no idea that the route they were stumbling across was actually a hidden bridge between 2 continents. This path existed only because of the Ice Age. Seas had frozen, water levels had fallen, and land buried beneath the oceans suddenly emerged. This hunter tribe, carrying the same genes as humans from thousands of years earlier, crossed this dry, narrow land and stepped into a place we now call the New World America. They didn't even know they were about to change the course of history. Time passed. 11,000 years later, the Ice Age ended, the seas rose again, and that land bridge disappeared forever beneath the water. Today we call it the Bering Strait, the place where the distance between the old and new world narrows to just 85 kilometers. But the interesting thing is, humanity took 10,500 years to cross those same 85 kilometers again. So what did those people do in the new world? How did they survive? Who first discovered this land? And how did a nation there eventually become a global superpower? This is the mystery we are unlocking today in Unlocked History Hub. The hunter group that entered the New World slowly spread across the entire vast continent. Over centuries, they didn't just build settlements, they created great civilizations. Look at this ancient map. This is the earliest face of the New World. The region we now call Mexico was once home to a mighty empire. The Aztec Empire spread over 200,000 square kilometers, made up of 500 states, with a population of 6 million. It excelled in art, warfare, architecture, and religion. Below the Aztecs was the Maya civilization, around 4,000 years old, masters of knowledge, architecture, calendars, art, and culture. Their giant pyramids still stand as proof of human brilliance. And further south, another great realm, the Inca Empire, stretching from Ecuador to Chile and Argentina. Nearly 12 million people, and remarkable city planning across mountains, forests, and valleys. Besides these 3 great civilizations, the entire continent was filled with countless settlements, small villages, local tribes, different languages, and diverse cultures. In the West Indies lived the Arawak people, and from Canada to Brazil, from Argentina to Alaska, Native American tribes thrived, with maize as their most important crop food, strength, and culture. During this time, millions also lived in the Old World, but incredibly, both worlds were completely unaware of each other's existence. For them, the New World was only a myth, never a reality, and so, 2 worlds, to humanity, remained apart for thousands of years. This is the story of that forgotten land. This is the real history of America.
1700 years ago, ancient Chinese poets mentioned a land they imagined to be beyond this world, a region they called Fusang, a name meaning beyond 10 worlds, a place that seemed outside the boundaries of our Earth. The poets wrote that east of the Eastern Sea there is a shore, the shore of Fusang, and if someone were to travel another 5,000 kilometers further east from there, they would reach a sea that is blue, vast, and stretches beyond the horizon. Was this mere poetry? Or was Fusang really the place we today call America? Because directly east of China lies America, and beyond it indeed stretches the Atlantic Ocean. In the year 458 CE, a Buddhist monk from Afghanistan named Hui Shen also undertook a long journey eastward. He set out with 4 companions, spent 40 years in an unknown land, and when he returned, he named the place Fusang. He wrote a travelogue describing the customs and landscapes of this new world. 500 years after Hui Shen, the seafaring peoples of northern Europe, the Vikings reached the coasts of America. They settled in Newfoundland, the same region that is now part of Canada. The layout of their settlements still exists today. This world was not seen only by poets or monks, but also by brave sailors who set foot there. Similarly, some Muslims claim that during the rule of the Umayyad Caliph, Abd al-Rahman III, their sailors reached America. They say they established settlements, built mosques, and spread Islam. On the other hand, some Hindus claim that their deities were part of the religious concepts of ancient American tribes as if some Hindu traveler reached America and left their influence behind, countless such claims are scattered throughout history. Whether they are true or false may not matter. The real question is, who really discovered this land? Who first understood that it was a new world? And who connected it to the old world? Neither the Chinese, nor the Afghan Buddhist travelers, nor the Muslim sailors, nor the Hindu visitors. Anyone understood that two separate worlds existed. No one realized that an entire continent was completely separate from Europe, Asia, and Africa. Thus, the two worlds, America and the Old World, remained entirely isolated from each other for thousands of years. People in the Old World believed the world ended with Europe and Africa, and that beyond it lay only the sea. And the Native American tribes thought the same, that beyond their coasts lay only water, and nothing else. What is out of sight becomes out of mind as well. This separation might have continued for thousands more years. But then the 15th century arrived, a century that changed the entire map of global power. Europe, which had been a major power until then, now stood at a crossroads where it was forced to seek new lands, new routes, new directions, new hopes. And the greatest reason behind this shift was the Muslim conquests. It was these conquests that altered the trade routes of the world, limited Europe, and compelled it to venture into the oceans. And in this quest, Europe reached a land that the Native Americans had left thousands of years earlier. This is the real story of discovery, a journey from one world to another that forever changed the course of history. Europe's wobbling empire, and the defeat that changed the world gradually. The Roman Empire weakened. The great power that once ruled 3 continents had now shrunk to just one city, the Byzantine Empire, not a full empire anymore, but a monument of the past, a final fortress standing on old walls. Then came 1453, the year that closed a chapter of Roman history that had spanned centuries forever. The armies of Ottoman Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror broke through the gates of Constantinople, not in a single moment, but amid blood, cannons, and the deafening roar of steel. When the smoke cleared, the last breaths of the Roman Empire had vanished. The city's name was changed to Istanbul, and a heavy veil of grief settled over Europe. Why? Because Constantinople was not just a city, it was Europe's military stronghold, the heart of Orthodox Christianity, and the home of the grand church built by Constantine Hagia Sophia. Europeans considered it sacred, a dream, a faith, but along with faith, another lifeline was tied to this city, the artery of trade. This was the gateway through which all goods from China and Central Asia entered Europe. Silk, spices, precious stones, gold, silver, everything from daily necessities to luxuries passed through this route. After the Ottoman conquest, this route was cut off. This was the moment when the foundations of Europe shook. Europe's economic death, hunger, crime, and the night of despair. The closure of trade routes meant markets empty, workshops closed, stomachs empty. Hunger spread across European cities. People had nothing to eat. Mothers even left their children on heaps of garbage. Peasants were crushed under debt. Some committed suicide, and others were forced to live lives akin to slavery. When hunger twisted people's hands, they turned to looting. Streets, once full of life, became webs of death. Passersby feared not the steps on the ground, but stones hanging from the sky. Criminals dropped rocks from windows onto people passing below, crushed heads, and then fled with whatever they could grab from the bodies. The wealthy had guards. The common people had only prayers. This was Europe's economic grave, opened wide after the fall of Constantinople. Spiritual shock. The Christian world collapsing, but Europe feared more than hunger. It feared the trembling of its soul. The brave Crusader era had passed. Now, every day, a new territory was falling under Muslim control. Followers of Christianity feared that perhaps their religious power would vanish. A fear, a helplessness, and a question. What next? And it was this fear that forced Europe to make a decision. Search for a new world, find new routes, or perish. But Europe had no idea that just a few thousand kilometers to the west, a world existed so vast that it was almost equal to the known world. A world full of gold, silver, forests, food, and countless resources. They were unaware of this world. Their eyes were fixed only eastward, toward China and Japan. Marco Polo, the book that drove Europe crazy. In Europe's homes, coffeehouses, and royal courts, everywhere, stories of one book were circulating. The Travels of Marco Polo. He wrote Cathay for China, and Cipango for Japan. And about Japan, his words spun the minds of all Europe. The palace roofs there are made of gold, the windows and doors are gold, and even the floors are often decorated with gold. Europe's hungry, tired, and desperate people read this and clung to one hope. If we can reach China and Japan, perhaps our fortune will change. They did not know that the route to fortune was not east, but hidden to the west. Thus, in the pages of history, there came a moment when an Italian merchant, Marco Polo, ignited the sleeping hopes of Europe through his writings. Tales of China, its treasures, and the immense wealth of the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan. Marco Polo described it as if it were a paradise on earth. Whatever the truth might have been, one thing was certain. For Europe, drowning in the darkness of poverty and despair, these stories were the only glimmer of light, showing dreams grand, unbelievable dreams. It was these golden accounts of Marco Polo that stirred restlessness in the hearts of Europe's youth. A restless desire awakened to somehow reach China, Japan, and Cipango, to the lands where the rivers of wealth flowed, as Polo had exaggeratedly described. But there was one problem: the route. The overland paths had been blocked by the Turks. Other routes, through the Mediterranean and Egypt, were under the control of powerful Muslim empires, where attacks on European ships were commonplace. Thus, all of Europe found itself trapped, with reaching Asia seeming nearly impossible. Although brave explorers like Bartholomew Dias succeeded in navigating around Africa, the journey was so long that even a one-way trip took months. Europe's growing problems boiled down to a single question: which route was both short, safe, and a direct path to the doorstep of Asia? In this era of helplessness, a figure emerged to change the course of history: a relatively unknown Italian navigator, a man who claimed not only to know a direct route to Asia, but one in which enemy empires would not obstruct him. This route lay across the Atlantic Ocean. This claim came from a young man named Christopher Columbus. The Genoese navigator had spent most of his life at sea. Marco Polo's writings had inspired dreams in him as well. His skill in navigating by stars, sun, and moon gave him confidence. Like other educated men of his time, he also knew that the earth was round. On this belief, he asserted that if Europe sailed westward, Japan Cipango could be reached in just 4,500 kilometers. Reaching Japan meant opening the doors to China, and thereby gaining access to all the gold mines of Asia. But Columbus's dreams were not limited to gold, spices, and wealth. A religious zeal also grew within him. He called himself a Christ's bearer, one who carries Christ's burden. According to Christian tradition, a man named Christopher had once carried Jesus across a river on his back, and thus came to be known as a Christ-bearer. Columbus adopted this role for himself. In his mind, there was a vision: a new world where he could plant the flag of Christianity, a desire to establish a great Christian empire, even greater than the Roman Empire, one whose foundation he himself would lay. He believed that finding this new route would not only end Europe's poverty, but also restore Christianity to power. This was the passion that carried him from court to court, from Italy to Portugal, and then to England. Columbus's journey was not simple. At every court, walls of rejection rose before him. No one believed him, yet he did not relent. In his eyes burned the same spark that Marco Polo's pages had ignited. The dreams that had inspired Europe's poor generations centuries earlier now shimmered in Columbus's eyes as a new world across the ocean. In every European court, Columbus continued to present his plan for a westward voyage, always accompanied by dreams of wealth and riches. He knew how dire Europe's condition was. Poverty had already broken people's backs. The social system was weak, and waves of despair swept across the land. Yet the reality was that no king or queen was willing to support him. Still, Columbus remained steadfast, never lost courage, and kept trying persistently. Finally, in 1485, he arrived in Spain. At that time, Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella sat on the throne, fully engaged in their campaign to expel the Muslims from the country. Columbus spent 7 years in Spain, visiting various courts to present his proposal. But the Queen had no time. She was focused on her major plans. In 1491, when Granada, the last stronghold of the Muslims, was close to its final defeat, the Queen summoned Columbus to her court. Columbus confidently presented his plan. He claimed that his proposal was the best and that it would surely succeed. He said he would reach the resources of this world via the routes to China and Japan, bringing back so much gold and wealth that Spain would become the richest country in the world. At the same time, the new lands he would reach would make it easier to spread Christianity and extend the influence of the Spanish crown. Queen Isabella, seeing the ambition of Columbus's plan, his skill, and his religious zeal, granted him permission and declared financial support. Thus, Columbus achieved his first success in the Spanish court. However, Queen Isabella did not know that the man she was trusting was hiding a secret. Columbus kept even his sailors and crew completely in the dark. This deception was so deep and dangerous that it put everyone's lives at risk. Why did Columbus's companions begin to plot against him? Under what obsession was he making promises that could not be fulfilled? And what was the secret that opened the doors of danger for his crew? All these mysteries and the story of Columbus's dangerous plan will be revealed in the next episode, the second episode of History of America.
Christopher Columbus, a name the world knows today as a brave adventurer. But the truth is far more tangled, wrapped in fog, and astonishing. Columbus had not only deceived the Queen of Spain, but even his own sailors. He presented himself as the king of the sea, the reader of winds, and a master of maps. But the truth was that he was just an average sailor, someone who could use a few instruments, had done some minor work on a few voyages, and liked reading books. But he was no legend of the maritime world. Yet this very average sailor began a journey whose outcome was unknown even to his sailors, and perhaps not fully known to Columbus himself. Time passed. The sea was restless. The winds sometimes supported him, sometimes turned against him, and in the hearts of the sailors, rebellion slowly began to hiss like a snake, until one day they secretly decided that if this captain was going to get them all killed, they would kill him themselves. Why did the sailors grow such hatred for their own captain? How did Columbus escape the noose of certain death? And were these 3 ships even capable of reaching the New World? You are watching Unlocked History Hub, and in the second episode of this new series, we take you on a journey that became one of the most dangerous, uncertain, and mysterious sea expeditions in history. Spain's net of promises, what was truth and what was deception. Before the voyage began, the Spanish crown had made grand promises to Columbus. The first promise: Columbus would be included among the nobility and given the title of Caballero, a title that allowed an ordinary man to add Don before his name, meaning an ordinary sailor would become part of Spain's most honored class. The second promise: Columbus would become the Grand Admiral, the same rank held by the highest admirals of Castile. The third promise: from all the lands discovered, 10% of the precious riches would belong solely to Columbus, and from every trading ship passing through those lands, 1/8 of the cargo would be reserved for his private trade. These promises sounded impressive, but the truth was that Spain was drowning in poverty. Resources were low, the treasury was empty, and the Queen had nothing to offer, except promises. That's why she gave Columbus only 2 ships. And even those were not provided from the royal treasury. They were seized forcefully from the people living in that region. The Queen had clearly said, "Since you have disobeyed the state, as punishment, you will hand over 2 of your ships to the crown for a year." And thus Columbus ended up with 2 weak, average quality ships. Food, very little. Weapons, almost none. Equipment, insufficient. Crew, only 89 men. Yet Columbus did not give up. He borrowed money and acquired a 3rd ship, the Santa Maria, which became his personal flagship. The beginning of the voyage: prayers, knees, bells, and an unknown future. 3rd August, church bells echoed in the air. Both the king and queen stood with their hands raised in prayer. Columbus adjusted his soldier-like hat, looked at the large white sails marked with red crosses, took a deep breath, and set off on the journey that would forever change the map of the world. The first stop was the Canary Islands. The winds here naturally pushed ships westward, the exact direction in which Columbus set out to find Japan. According to his calculations, Japan was only 4,500 kilometers away, but in reality, it was the greatest mathematical deception in the world. Alone in the ocean, no path, no hope, no land beyond the Canary Islands. The sea would not end, nor would the blue of the sky. The early days were easy. Winds friendly, waves gentle, sailors cheerful, and ships calm. Every morning Columbus would have breakfast in his cabin, look to the sky and pray, and encourage his crew daily. The direction is correct. The voyage is safe. Land is near. But the truth, land was far, and their courage was breaking day by day. This was the time when the sailors began doubting every word Columbus said, and then, doubt turned into rebellion. Here the story takes its truly thrilling turn, because now only one question remained aboard the 3 ships. Columbus woke up every morning before sunrise. He would stand on the deck, raise both his palms toward the sky in the middle of the vast ocean, and silently pray. But even this prayer had now become more of a show than a habit, because as soon as the prayer ended, he would walk among the sailors, speak to them with complete confidence, give orders, and then return to his cabin to take out the same instrument that always impressed everyone. This instrument was an old, half-circle-shaped astrolabe with a thin string hanging beneath it, and at the end of the string a small brass weight. Whenever Columbus held it against the sun or the stars, the weight would begin to sway. The others would see this and think he was some sort of magician, but in reality it was all guesswork. To put it plainly, Columbus had less knowledge and more acting. Yet this trick of his was enough to make them believe he was an expert, and he continued pushing the ships westward. In the beginning, everything seemed right. According to the books, Land should have appeared within 10 to 15 days. The sailors were happy, and hope was alive, but when 20 days passed, cracks began to appear on the face of hope. No sign of land, no birds, no clouds, only the endless blue void, and the merciless waves beneath. Fear took root in the hearts of the sailors. Then the whispers began. "This Italian will get us killed. He only wants to become a Don. Our corpses will be eaten by fish, while this madman keeps staring at stars." Hunger began to grow. Water started running low, and with each passing day the silence of the sea attacked them. They felt that if the ship wasn't turned back now, they would all die. 2 more days passed and fear completely overtook them, so much that even the thought of death started feeling lighter, as if they understood that the sea had already written their fate. They demanded to return, but Columbus flatly refused. This refusal was like pouring oil on burning wood. Now some sailors decided that if the captain would not agree, then keeping the captain alive was foolishness. The plan of murder spread across all 3 ships. There was another reason Columbus was not Spanish. He was Italian. All the other sailors were from Spain. They said, "If he dies, no one loses, neither us nor Spain. Throw him into the sea and say it was an accident. One death will save the rest." The rebellion against Columbus rose like a swelling wave. If he gave an order, the sailors would bark back or threaten him. Columbus would smile outside and pretend to be confident, but the moment he entered his cabin, he would shut the door and breathe deeply. He had begun to feel that his life was truly in danger. Sometimes he tried bribing them, sometimes promises, sometimes new stories. But now only 2 things remained on the faces of the sailors: anger and fear. Time had reached a point where minds begin breaking from reality. Days grew longer, nights darker, and exhaustion seeped into their bones. Then illusions began. A sailor would point at the sky and scream, "There, that's land. I saw it." The ship would be turned in that direction, but there would be nothing, just sunlight, waves, and that endless blue water. But one day, when all the greenery of hope had completely died, a sailor suddenly broke the silence and shouted, "Birds! I heard birds." The entire crew looked up at the sky, and then truly, from somewhere far, a small sound came, like life gently taking a breath. The sailors began shouting like madmen, and then one evening, black dots appeared in the sky, slowly forming into large flocks. These were the migrating birds that fly from North America to the West Indies for winter. Seeing the birds, the withered hope in the sailors' hearts suddenly bloomed again. It was as if someone had poured light into their souls. Columbus immediately changed the course of the ships and announced, "We are close to land, very close." But 2 days passed. No land. The sound of birds, however, grew stronger, keeping both hope and anxiety alive. Then 3 more days passed. Sometimes birds appeared, sometimes they vanished, but land, nowhere. This was the last thread of the sailors' patience. Now they gathered around Columbus, encircled him, and in a thundering voice said, "Either turn the ships around now, or we will throw you into the sea." For 5 weeks, Columbus had controlled them with excuses and false promises. But now he had no promise left, no excuse, no knowledge. Only one thing remained, a final attempt to buy time. With a trembling yet firm voice, he said, "Give me just 3 more days. If in 3 days we do not find land, I will return with you myself." These were the 3 days that were either going to change the history of humanity or write the death of Columbus. Columbus, after giving the sailors a final 3-day deadline, had, as if calculated his own fate. For him now, asking to return was not just defeat, it was equal to death. This fear pushed him into a kind of madness. The speed of all 3 ships was increased unusually, such a speed that if in the darkness of night any hidden rock existed, the ship would crash straight into it and shatter. But Columbus no longer cared about danger. He saw only the west, only land, only one last hope of survival. The nights had become long. Cold winds blew, and the wooden planks of the ships creaked as if the sea itself was telling them, "Turn back. You don't belong here." On the night of the 11th of October, when a thin mist of clouds covered the sky, Columbus was pacing on the deck. He kept fixing his gaze on the distant horizon, his eyes so tired that sometimes it seemed something was visible, and sometimes nothing at all. Then, around 10 o'clock, he felt that far away, on the edge of the horizon, some sort of light was flickering. It wasn't a bulb, not a lamp, not any human-made light. In that era, such a light being visible from miles away was impossible. Yet he felt certain that something was there. Some shine, some spark, some sign. He immediately called his crew. "Look, there is a light." But everyone who stood beside him said the same thing. "We can't see anything, Captain. Maybe you're mistaken." Some laughed quietly in their hearts. Others called it an illusion. The light vanished, and the sea once again drowned in darkness. Today we know that the direction in which Columbus saw that flash. The nearest island was about 56 kilometers away. From that distance no lamp, no fire, no reflection could be seen, meaning that light did not exist at all. But for hours after that illusion, a young sailor sitting on the mast of the Pinta suddenly let out a scream. His voice tore through the deep silence of the night. "Terhalun!" In the moonlight, a sandy island slowly began rising above the water's surface. Clear, bright, and undeniably real. No illusion, no mirage. It was truly land. The captain of the Pinta wasted no moment and fired a small cannon. Its loud boom awakened the sleeping hope across the sea. The crews of the Nina and the Santa Maria immediately began shouting, eyes full of tears, voices trembling. After 36 days of constant fear, hunger, and rebellion, land stood before them in reality. The maps of the world were about to change forever. Columbus stepped forward and smiled at the Pinta's captain, Martin Alonso. "Senna Martin, you have seen land." The captain bent forward at once, as if the weight of years had lifted from his shoulders. "Sir, I hope my reward will not be lost." Columbus, in his characteristic arrogance, said, "I will give you 5,000 maravedis as a gift." But a twist in the story was still waiting. As soon as the ships reached closer to shore, the same sailors who just yesterday were thinking of killing him, today were circling around him. "Captain, we made a mistake. Please forgive us. You were the one who saved us. And when it comes to rewards, please remember us too." They were afraid that Columbus, in anger, might seize their wages and rewards. But what happened was even more shocking. The reward that the Spanish government had promised for the sailor who saw land first, Columbus kept it for himself. His justification was, "I saw the light before anyone else. Therefore, the first right is mine," even though that light turned out to be nothing but an illusion. No reality, no proof. But that one lie snatched away the chance of a poor sailor's life changing forever. Here we see a glimpse of the same Columbus, whose character later became one of the darkest in history. Despite this entire achievement, Columbus was still trapped in a misunderstanding. He believed he had reached Asia, perhaps near Japan, perhaps at the shores of China. He had no idea that he had stepped into a world that had remained cut off from the rest of humanity for thousands of years since the Ice Age. A land where humans had migrated from the Siberian hunting grounds, and which had lived for 25,000 years with its own civilizations. But the tragedy, the world that welcomed him, that showed him friendship and goodwill in the coming years. Those same people discovered that Columbus and his companions were not heroes, but executioners. Why? What had the Native Americans expected? And what catastrophe did Columbus unleash upon those innocent people in the greed for gold? To know this, wait for the next episode of the History of America, where we will see how humans first entered this new world, and how Columbus, upon arriving there, became the beginning of one of the darkest eras in history.
When Columbus's massive ships approached the shores of the New World, the innocent inhabitants of the island saw a scene they had never imagined in their entire lives. It seemed to them as if some heavenly thing had emerged from the depths of the sea. Some magic, some strange power, completely different from their world. They looked at those gigantic ships with amazement, and then at the humans descending from them, whose bodies were covered with shining, colorful clothes, who held sparkling iron objects in their hands, and whose voices had sounds whose meanings they could not understand. All of this felt to them as if a new world from the sky had landed on their island. Simplicity was part of their nature. Without thinking, they offered their boats to those strange guests, shared their food, gave them water, and happily talked and laughed with them. They had no idea that these very guests would, in the coming time, prove to be the greatest enemies of their freedom, their land, and their lives. When Columbus stepped onto the shore, the island people ran and gathered around him. They touched his boats, looked at his clothes, and listened with amazement to every word of his language. Columbus spent some time on the shore, observed everything carefully, and then returned to his ship. But his mind kept working continuously. He saw a sign in everything. And above all, he was greedy for gold. A few days later, he again lowered the boats into the water and moved along the coast. By then, the news of his arrival had spread to every corner of the island. The local people gathered at the shore to welcome him, offered him food and drink, and even gave beautiful, colorful parrots as gifts. Columbus's crew gave him red caps and small bells, and the jingling sound of the bells made the island people dance with joy. But Columbus had no such love in his heart. He was smiling, but in his eyes, there was only one thing: gold. He noticed that the people were living extremely simple lives. They had no iron, no weapons, no big houses, no large fortresses. But some people had tiny gold rings in their noses. And this was the very thing that shook Columbus's mind. He remembered Marco Polo's travelogue, in which it was written that near Japan Cipango, there were small islands where people lived and where there was plenty of gold. Columbus assumed that he had reached very close to Japan. There he wrote in his diary that these people were naked, defenseless, unaware, and extremely innocent. They had no iron, no steel, and no skill with which they could attack. With cruel confidence, Columbus wrote that with just 50 men, all of them can be enslaved. This was the thinking that later brought a sea of destruction. Columbus and his men began entering the houses of the local people. They overturned things to search for gold, broke utensils, picked up objects and threw them aside. The local people could not understand why these strangers were behaving like this. Yet they still smiled at them, gave them water, and continued to help them as guests. After spending many days, disappointment began to grow in Columbus's heart. He began to feel that perhaps there was not as much gold here as the travelogue had described. But then, another idea lit up in his mind. He thought, this is just the beginning. The real place is still ahead. Japan, meaning Cipango. Thinking this, he forcibly captured some people of the island, tied them with ropes, and imprisoned them on his ship. His idea was that he would teach them a few words of his language and turn them into guides. Then he would take these guides to the islands ahead so they could help him understand the nearby routes. Maybe behind these islands was the place that Marco Polo had mentioned. But those poor people did not even know the name Cipango. They had no concept of China. They knew nothing beyond their tiny world. And Columbus, rather than understanding, he kept believing blindly. He was searching for a world that did not exist on this path. This misunderstanding gave birth to the greatest collision of truth in history. Columbus never reached Japan. Instead, he changed an entire new world forever. When the guides captured by Columbus paid attention to his words, they realized that this foreign man was talking about a very large island. Those local guides already knew the direction of a big island and the route to reach it. So they began taking Columbus toward that large landmass through their boats. That place exists on our maps today by the name of Cuba. Throughout the entire journey, Columbus was walking under the shadow of a misunderstanding. He had convinced himself that he was about to reach Japan, Cipango. Every island he saw made him think that perhaps this was the place whose golden tales had ignited the minds of Europe. But when he reached the shores of Cuba on the 28th of October, the reality was very different from his dreams. No shine of gold, no royal buildings, no gates of China that he was searching for. Yet he immediately constructed a new imaginary picture in his mind. If this is not Japan, then maybe this is China. Maybe I have reached Cathay, but it was neither China nor Japan. In the faces, houses, and lifestyles of the local people, there is not even a glimpse of the grand cities, written by Marco Polo. Yes, they had golden rings in their noses and ears, and just that tiny shine was enough to ignite the fire inside Columbus. Columbus looked up at the sky in astonishment, and perhaps whispered, "Oh God, what is the story of this place? Did Marco Polo exaggerate, or was it all a lie, that there is gold everywhere here?" The disappointment grew. Then on the 5th of December, he held on to another hope. He set out searching for that Chinese city, which was called Alivo in Europe, known today as Chubonso. But the place he was going toward had neither Alivo nor China, only another island. On the way a headwind blew, and Columbus's ship began changing direction. This wind brought them almost 100 kilometers away from Cuba, to another large island. Its local name was Haiti. Columbus landed on it on the 6th of December and, according to his tradition, gave it a new name, Hispaniola. This was the moment when the real story of the destruction of the local inhabitants began, a devastation which many historians today call the American Holocaust. Hispaniola was at that time the second largest island of the West Indies. Today, two countries exist here, the Dominican Republic and Haiti. But in that era, it was all one land, and about 800,000 people of the Arawak race lived here. These people too were innocent, kind and harmless as always. They welcomed Columbus as if some lost traveler had reached home. Columbus again felt a strange impression that this might be an island at the edge of Cipango. His religious mindset pushed him toward another idea. He thought that perhaps this was the place from where, according to the Bible, Prophet Solomon used to receive gold and fragrant things. Or maybe this was the region known as the Kingdom of the Queen of Sheba, although in reality, the region of Prophet Solomon was in a completely different part of the world, and had no connection at all with Hispaniola. This was all just Columbus's habit of fitting every new thing into old books. There was no accurate geography in his mind, nor any logic. But he had one sign that kept fueling his fire: traces of gold. Columbus's men had seen specks of gold in the water of rivers and streams. Then a local chief gave Columbus a gold mask as a gift. Now it was as if he had fully believed that the entire island was filled with gold, and the locals were simply hiding the true place. But the truth was something else. Hispaniola at that time did not have much gold. Whatever tiny amount existed remained hidden in sand. The Europeans did not have modern excavation tools, nor did the locals have the knowledge of minerals. An interesting fact is that today in the region of Haiti, there are reserves of gold, silver and copper worth trillions of rupees. But in Columbus's era, no one knew of them. Despite his disappointment, Columbus decided that he would return to Spain, bring more soldiers and people, and then search the entire island to extract gold. But matters began worsening before that. Columbus's men had a conflict with the local people. In a small dispute, he had 2 innocent inhabitants killed, only because they refused to give the Europeans the bow and arrows they had asked for. These conflicts were still small, but these were the very sparks that were about to turn into a fire. Columbus knew that if he returned to Spain, he would need some strong proof of his success. One of his ships had run aground and broken near the coast of Haiti. He turned this accident to his advantage. He had his men remove the wood and built a small fort, Fort Navidad. This was the first brick of European occupation. In this fort he left his 49 men, so that in his absence they would continue searching for gold. Then on the 16th of January, 1493, he set out towards Spain. As he left, he forcibly took some local people as slaves. Along the way, cold, hunger, and disease claimed the lives of many local slaves. Their deaths were considered by the Europeans as simply making enough space. When he reached Spain, Columbus announced that he had discovered a new route to Asia, and that there was vast gold there. His claims were believed. He was given the title Admiral of the Sea. Celebrations were held, feasts were arranged, and Columbus rose as a hero. But in those very feasts, people also mocked him. Why? Because everyone knew that his new world was not actually Asia. But still he was not being denied. Time itself had to prove the truth. And this was the time when Columbus's name was about to be linked to the greatest massacre in history. The innocent world of Cuba and Hispaniola was now standing at the edge of destruction. Killing, slavery, cruelty, and ruin. All of this was about to come. What was the end of this? Why were trials held against him? How were the people of Hispaniola able to offer their last resistance? And did they really use a small plant as a weapon to astonish the Europeans? You will see all of this in the next episode of History of America. And if you want, you can also watch the previous episodes of History of America here.
When Columbus and his companions set foot in the New World, they inflicted such brutality on the native people that a Spanish historian writes, "Whenever I try to record these atrocities, my hands begin to tremble. On just one island of Hispaniola, the Spanish army wiped out almost 8 million human beings, those people who had lived for thousands of years in a world of peace, love, and simplicity. How were those Native Americans pushed into this hell? Columbus, who was once shown as a hero in stories, how did he become a villain in history, and how did his life end?" You are watching our YouTube channel, Unlocked History Hub, and we are showing you History of America Part 4. It is said that at a banquet, someone asked Columbus, "If you had not discovered a route to Asia, someone else would have done it. Then what great achievement did you accomplish?" Columbus quietly asked for some eggs. He told everyone, "Try to make them stand upright." Everyone tried, but the eggs kept rolling to the sides. Then Columbus picked up an egg, tapped it lightly on the table, and made it stand upright. He explained to the people present, "The world thinks every success is easy, but the person who takes the first step deserves the real credit, whether the story is true or just an example." But Columbus once again won the hearts of the rulers of Spain. At that moment he demanded from the king and queen, "Give me a large army, so that I may bring gold from the New World, or that Asia which I have discovered. And if you wish, the native people can also be sent to Spain as slaves." The rulers were so swayed by his promises that they gave Columbus a grand fleet of 17 ships, more than 1,300 soldiers and crew, swords, guns, gunpowder, and ferocious trained dogs. All were part of this army. On his first voyage he had only 90 men, but now he had the power of nearly 2,000 people in his hands, enough power to crush the entire population of Hispaniola. When Columbus arrived at Hispaniola with his ships, the moment he stepped ashore, a horrifying truth shook him. The 49 Spaniards he had left at Fort Navidad all had been killed. As soon as he left for Spain, those soldiers wandered through forests and villages in search of gold. They abducted women and children, used them for rape, torture, and slavery. Eventually the natives had enough. They attacked the fort, killed the Spaniards, and burned Fort Navidad. Seeing this, Columbus was filled with a mad rage. He ordered his soldiers find gold, and enslave any native you can. But by then the entire region already understood the truth, that these strangers were not good. They had come to enslave them and steal their gold. People abandoned their villages and fled into the forests. When the Spaniards reached their homes, there were only empty huts. Gold was nowhere to be found either. By 1495, Columbus was drowning in continuous failures. No gold was found, so he adopted a new, demonic strategy: slavery. He gathered his entire army and launched large-scale attacks on the villages of Hispaniola. 1,500 men, women, and children were captured. They were chained like animals, beaten, and locked in pens. Guards and bloodthirsty dogs were assigned for watch. 500 strong slaves were sent to Spain. On the way, nearly 200 died from diseases. Those who reached Spain, they could not survive the European climate and soon died. This slavery also failed. So Columbus adopted yet another cruel method: forced labor. In Haiti he ordered that every man over the age of 14 must bring a fixed amount of gold every 3 months. Those who completed the task were given a copper token to hang around their neck. Whoever did not have this token, their hands were cut off, and they bled to death. Thousands of people were sent into the mountains to dig those mountains from top to bottom again and again. Those who washed the gold had to remain bent for hours in water. Their backs broke. In these mines at least 1/3 of the population died from hunger and diseases. Men were sent to far-off mines. Women were forced into agriculture, and the labor was so extreme that the entire nation became barren. Mothers could not breastfeed their babies, because hunger had destroyed their bodies. Thousands of children died from starvation, and many mothers drowned their own babies, because they could not watch them die in agony. This was the world that Columbus and his companions created in the New World, where the greed for gold buried humanity itself. Husbands would breathe their last in the darkness of the mines, wives would collapse and die in the fields, and children, crying in hunger, shriveled and died in their mother's arms. Within just a few years, this fertile land, which was once full of life, became empty of humans, transformed into a graveyard. A Spanish writer who came after Columbus saw this destruction with his own eyes. He writes, "The scenes were such that my soul began to tremble. Even describing these horrors is torment. Time kept passing, but instead of decreasing, the cruelty increased. The Spaniards had become so addicted to luxury that they no longer wished to walk. They used the native people like animals. Sometimes they sat on a man's back and traveled, and sometimes they sat comfortably in a hanging hammock made of ropes. Two natives would walk forward and backward, carrying the weight. The slave walking behind would shade the masters with large leaves, and the other would cool them by fanning them with bird feathers. These were the same Spaniards who called themselves the most civilized people of the world. Yet they considered the blood, honor, and lives of Native Americans cheaper than grains of sand. They had arrived in the New World as explorers, but within a few months they had become savage executioners. Some soldiers, just to test the sharpness of their swords, would skin living human beings, and they would stand and watch their screams as if it were entertainment. Once, 2 soldiers cut off the heads of 2 natives simply because they liked their parrots, and for fun, they also blew off the heads of 2 children. This barbarity was not limited to Hispaniola. On other islands of the West Indies, death was dancing as well. In Cuba alone, in just 3 months, 7,000 children died. The Native Americans saw all this, and became exhausted from forced labor, massacres, rape, and humiliation. They resisted, but they were wounded before the European weapons. Many left their homes and hid in mountains and dense forests. But even there, their lives were not safe. Spanish soldiers chased them with bloodthirsty dogs. Whoever came into their hands, they shot them dead. Whoever managed to flee, they set the dogs on them. The dogs tore their bodies into pieces and devoured them. When death was seen spreading everywhere, the native people made one final, unbelievable decision. One fruit, which they called cassava, became both the source of their survival and their death. This fruit was their food, and its extracted poison was used on the tips of their hunting arrows. When humans snatched away from them the right to remain human, the Arawak people decided that rather than living in enduring slavery and humiliation, it is better to die. They began mass suicides using the poisonous substance of cassava. Mothers poured the poison into the mouths of their children so they wouldn't have to hear their screams from European hands. But of course, not everyone could kill themselves. Many fled to other islands. Among them was the great chief of Hispaniola, Hachui. He took his people with him and reached Cuba. He had a small amount of gold. He placed that gold before his people and said, "This is the root of our destruction. This glowing stone is what has become our death." He threw that gold into the river so that European greed would not follow it. But the blind river of greed never stops. The Spaniards reached Cuba as well. They killed half the tribe of Hachui and enslaved the rest. But Hachui was neither shot nor enslaved. He was tied to a pile of dry wood in front of everyone, and they set it on fire. But moments before death, he spoke the most venomous truth in history. When a priest invited him to accept the truth and follow the path to heaven, Hachui replied, "If in heaven are the people who are Christians like you, then I would prefer to go to hell." It was a sentence that kept European priests ashamed for centuries. Murder, rape, slavery, starvation, if anyone was responsible for all of it, then it was the leader of that greed, Christopher Columbus. The gold he had promised, it never reached Spain, but the stories of his cruelty did reach the royal court of Spain, and then began the downfall of Columbus, which started at the hands of his own 2 brothers. In 1496, when Columbus went to Spain for the second time, he handed over the responsibility of the island to his brothers, but they committed even worse atrocities than those Columbus had begun. They snatched away whatever little freedom the native chiefs had, and created a new system of gold plundering. On the other hand, the Spaniards who had come to the New World after hearing tales of rivers of wealth became furious because here they found nothing but hunger, forests, and despair. The result was that a rebellion broke out against Columbus and his brothers, and piles of complaints reached the Spanish court. Finally, the King of Spain sent his Chief Justice to Hispaniola so that he could witness with his own eyes the truth of Columbus's empire of cruelty. By the time he reached the coasts of South America, that is the area of present-day Venezuela, Columbus had only one obsession: gold. He dug the land like a madman everywhere, asked people, and wandered along the shores. He was still firmly convinced that he was standing on the edges of Asia, the same Asia that Marco Polo had mentioned in his travelogues. and about which he believed that the very land was made of gold, although the reality was standing right in front of him, screaming that this was not the Asia of Marco Polo. For a person like Columbus, truth did not matter. He returned empty-handed from Venezuela and went back to Hispaniola. But this time, the situation was not in his hands. During this period, a high-ranking officer from Spain had arrived in Hispaniola, and he listened to all the complaints of the Spanish settlers and the native people regarding Columbus's cruelty, greed, and mismanagement. The result was that Columbus and both of his brothers were imprisoned in iron chains and sent to Spain in October 1500. But one of Columbus's abilities always worked, the power of speech. On the return voyage to Spain, he wrote a letter to the king and queen. In the letter, he explained in a highly emotional manner that although he had not yet found gold, he was very close to it. This was a final attempt, but it worked. The king and queen ordered his release and met him in Granada in December 1500. Columbus promised that if he were allowed to go again, he would return only when he had truly found gold. This promise pleased the royal couple, and he was allowed one last expedition. However, this time his governorship was taken away. He was no longer a ruler but merely an explorer. In 1502, he began his fourth and final voyage. He was still under the same delusion that he was near Asia. He even hoped that he might encounter Vasco da Gama somewhere, while in reality, they were thousands of miles apart. Columbus searched for gold everywhere in Honduras, Panama, and Nicaragua, but luck was not on his side. At one point, he became stranded with 57 companions at Santa Gloria in Jamaica. Food was scarce, the sea route was blocked, and hope began to die. He sent a few companions in a ship to Hispaniola for help, but as soon as they left, problems increased. Now, he had neither food nor help, and the natives were no longer willing to provide more food. At this point, Columbus played his strangest and most famous trick. He frightened the native chiefs into believing that God was displeased with them because they were not feeding his people. Columbus devised a new trick to pressure the native chiefs. He realized that now only a threat would work. He told the chiefs that due to their slowness and refusal to provide food, God was angry with them, and very soon he would punish them through famine, diseases, and a heavenly sign. He ordered them to look at the sky at night, because very soon the moon would turn blood red. The native people listened with wide eyes, but in reality, there was no divine wrath anywhere. The real story was something else. Columbus had a European astronomical calendar that listed the dates of lunar and solar eclipses. He already knew that 3 days later, on February 29, 1504, there would be a total lunar eclipse. This certainty gave him the courage to issue such a bold threat. When the night of the eclipse arrived, the moon indeed turned red. The Native Americans, terrified, ran to Columbus's tents and offered all the food, water, and whatever they had. Thus, Columbus saved his life by turning merely an astronomical event into the wrath of God. He remained stranded in Jamaica for almost a year. During this time, the companions he had sent on a ship to Hispaniola finally reached their destination, and ultimately help arrived in Jamaica. Columbus saved his life and returned to Spain via Hispaniola, but his return was not a sign of success. This voyage was one of the most failed and most painful experiences of his life. The man who had always dreamed of reaching China and Japan eventually returned to Spain in illness and old age, and stayed there until 1506. Columbus, whose expeditions had swallowed the lives of millions of native people, himself died in comfort. Until his death, he received the share promised to him from the gold of the New World. Even though he remained under the misconception until his last breath that he had reached Asia, immediately after his death, others recognized the deception. In 1511, the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci realized that this was not Asia but a completely new world. He saw the land from north to south where today the Amazon and Brazil are located. For this reason, the New World was called America after his name, Amerigo, but the wounds left by Columbus were very deep. Only 21 years after his arrival in the West Indies, the entire island of Hispaniola had been emptied of its human population. Nearly 8 million Arawak people were killed, died of disease, and starvation. According to historian David Stannard, the destruction in Hispaniola was 50 times greater than the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. The story of the other islands was different and even more horrific. When the native people were wiped out, European invaders brought black slaves from Africa who were forcibly settled in these lands. Thus began a new and long era of slavery. The Arawak nation did not completely disappear. The children who migrated to South America survived, and even today, their descendants are found in the regions of Venezuela, Guyana, and Suriname. The places where once Columbus's name was a symbol of fear, today it is considered a symbol of hatred. Even after Columbus's death, Spain's conquests did not stop. Their attention now turned beyond the West Indies to South America, where the Aztec Empire existed with glory and power. This was the place where the treasures, gold, and wealth truly were. But the Aztec people, unlike the Arawak, were not weak. They were strong warriors, their empire was powerful, and they put up a vigorous resistance to the European invaders. What happened next? Which was the last state that stood in the way of Spain? And which god did the Aztecs recognize after a long time? You will see all of this in the next episode of the History of America. Meanwhile, a complete documentary story exists on Mussolini's tragic life, and on the other side, a film based on the horrifying reality of the Sicilian Mafia. 11 years had passed since Columbus left the world, yet the earthquake his arrival had caused in the New World, its waves were still shaking various civilizations. Where modern-day Mexico City now stands, there was once a vast saline lake called Texcoco. In the middle of this lake, there was a city that surpassed any major city of that era. This was Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire. Spanning over 200,000 square kilometers, this empire was counted among the most advanced civilizations of its time. The city was connected to the outside world through strong bridges and roads. With a population of 6 million, it was an astonishing blend of cleanliness, architecture, wealth, and military power. 60,000 houses, tall buildings, grand temples, and floating gardens. It seemed as if humans had created a world of their own against nature. The city's canals were made of stone and supplied fresh water throughout the capital. Markets were always filled with thousands of people. Rivers and lakes had thin layers of gold floating on them, which were collected to make jewelry, statues, and royal items. The Aztecs were indeed warriors, but they were also bound by strict rules and superstitions. These very rules later proved disastrous for them. Right now, you are watching the Unlocked History Hub YouTube channel, and in History of America Part 4, you will see that one of the principles of the city's wealthy inhabitants was that deceiving the enemy in war was considered extreme cowardice. Attacking without declaring war was unacceptable. But not every principle serves well in life. Some rules sometimes turn into disasters. Such a disaster struck when a Spanish conqueror Hernan Cortes arrived to attack their empire with only 600 soldiers. In Iwi-Sik, Cortes had reached the island of Hispaniola in the West Indies in search of easy wealth, but after failing there, he reached Cuba, where his luck changed. Diego, the Spanish governor of Cuba, ordered him to raise an army, go to Mexico, and establish a new colony there. On February 18, 1519, Cortes set sail from Cuba with 608 soldiers and 11 ships. Soon his forces reached present-day Veracruz, which was part of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs did not perceive this small army as a threat. For a powerful nation of 6 million, a few hundred soldiers meant nothing. But the real danger lay hidden in their superstitions. An ancient Aztec legend said that one of their gods would return from across the sea in the future. When they saw Cortes on horseback, something they had never seen before, they mistakenly thought that perhaps their god had returned. This misunderstanding laid the foundation of their destruction. They provided Cortes with food, water, guidance, and geographical information. With their own hands, they revealed their weaknesses to an outsider. Cortes soon formed an alliance with the Aztec enemy tribes in the Tlaxcala region. An enemy's enemy is a friend, and this friendship became a death sentence for the Aztecs. Aztec Emperor Montezuma II was deeply confused by the situation. He could neither fully believe that these people were Spanish invaders, nor that they were truly gods. So he first tried diplomacy instead of war. He sent Cortes gold, silver, and precious gifts, requesting that if he came with hostile intentions, he should turn back. A 6.5-foot wide golden frame in the shape of the sun and a silver frame symbolizing the moon were also sent. But the gifts did not make Cortes a friend. They only made him greedier. He returned his helmet and demanded it be filled with more gold, claiming that his people suffered from a disease that could only be cured with gold. Montezuma showed generosity and sent back the helmet filled with gold. This was the moment when Cortes became certain that immense treasures were hidden in this empire. Cortes requested an inner visit to the capital. Montezuma accepted. In November 1519, Cortes entered Tenochtitlan with his 600 soldiers and 1,000 Tlaxcalan warriors. Montezuma received him with a royal welcome, but Cortes repaid this hospitality by taking him hostage. His soldiers did not allow him to leave the palace and demanded treasures. Even a palace wall was broken to loot gold. Had Cortes been given more time, he might have emptied the entire Aztec Empire of its treasures, but a new problem arose. The governor of Cuba claimed authority over Cortes' new colony. When Cortes refused, the governor sent a new army to Mexico to arrest him. When Cortes received the news that the governor had sent a new army to arrest him, a strange mix of anger and fear awoke within him. He knew that if he showed weakness now, his entire campaign, his whole conquest, would collapse. So, leaving only 80 companions to protect the emperor in the palace, he set out with the rest of his army toward the coast. It was a dangerous decision, because behind him, only a few dozen men remained in the palace, and ahead, a full Spanish army was coming to attack him. But Cortes was the kind of man who, instead of accepting defeat, would fight it and turn it into his victory. When he reached the coast, a battle took place whose outcome perhaps even the governor could never have imagined. Cortes not only defeated this new army, but also captured most of its soldiers. And, as always, lust for gold was Cortes' deadliest weapon. He promised the captured soldiers gold and won them over to his side. Now he had an army of nearly 1,400 warriors, small in number, but extremely dangerous. Cortes could barely contain his joy, but when he returned to Tenoch, what he saw froze the blood in his veins. The palace was under siege by the Aztecs. His soldiers had been trapped for several days. The reason: in Cortes' absence, his men had attacked during a sacred Aztec festival, brutally killing thousands of innocent Aztecs. This massacre changed everything. The illusion among the Aztecs that perhaps these pale-skinned strangers were the children of gods was now gone. The people were blinded by rage, and they were ready to annihilate the Spaniards by besieging the palace. Cortes struggled to break through the palace gates with his army and reached his companions. Inside, he witnessed a scene that left his men helpless. He quickly placed Emperor Montezuma II on the roof and ordered, "Tell your people, do not attack." But it was too late. The anger of the Aztec people had reached a point where even the emperor's words held no power, according to many historians. The Aztecs attacked the palace while Montezuma was still on the roof. During this attack, Montezuma was killed by his own people, or by the Spanish soldiers. The truth remained shrouded in mystery. But one fact was clear: the emperor was dead, and now Cortes had only one option: escape. On the night of June 30th later, called the Sad Night, the Spaniards gathered as much gold as they could and fled the palace under the cover of darkness. They knew the Aztecs did not fight at night, nor did they guard the city's bridges. But fate had other plans. As the Spaniards reached the western bridge, an Aztec woman spotted them and screamed loudly. Thousands of Aztec warriors surged toward them. Arrows rained down on the bridge. Many Spanish soldiers fell into the lake with gold-filled sacks, and that very gold became their death. They drowned under the weight. In that dark night, 400 to 600 Spanish soldiers were killed. Many of their local allies were also slaughtered. The Aztecs had achieved a great victory, yet it was not complete. Why? Because Cortes survived, and that was their misfortune. He regrouped his forces in Tlaxcala, where he spent a year planning his military strategy. This time, he prepared ships, cannons, and heavy artillery. But the greatest devastation of this war did not come from Spanish cannons or swords. It came from smallpox. The Spanish invaders had brought germs with them. The people of the New World had no defense against them. In the next 2 months, a large portion of Tenochtitlan's population perished. The city was struggling against disease, and in May 1521, Cortes launched his attack. This time, the Spaniards came in full force. Attacks from ships on one side, cannon fire on the other. The city's buildings, temples, homes, all turned to rubble. The Spaniards finally entered the city, crushing everything in their path. The Aztecs fought with unparalleled bravery. Every street, every neighborhood, every rooftop became a battlefield. But hunger, disease, and exhaustion broke them. Finally, the city fell. And what always happens when the conquerors win occurred: massacre. In one area, 12,000 people were killed. In another, just in a single day, 40,000 were slaughtered. The water supply was cut off. 50,000 people died of thirst. Even children could not survive. The great empire of Tenochtitlan, which had amazed the world for thousands of years, was reduced to dust within a few months before the Spanish army and a deadly epidemic. When the Spanish army captured Tenochtitlan, death and destruction reigned in every corner of the city. Corpses were scattered across every street. Some were Spanish soldiers. Some were Christian priests, holding high crosses, forcibly urging the dying to accept Christianity. These same priests and invaders threw Aztec religious leaders before dogs and burned their sacred books, because, in their view, all of this was heresy that needed to be eradicated. The Aztec Emperor Cuauhtémoc, Montezuma's successor and the last king, was also captured. Fire was set beneath his feet to force him to reveal where the treasures were hidden. but the emperor did not utter a word until his death. Eventually, he was hanged. Thus the Aztec Empire was destroyed forever, and the Spanish flag began to fly over Mexico. The story of the Inca Empire, even after conquering Mexico and the Aztec Empire, a major obstacle remained for Spain, and that was the Inca Empire. This empire was even larger, more powerful, and wealthier than the Aztec Empire. It had over 12 million people, stretched from Ecuador to Chile, with its capital in the Peruvian city of Cusco. When the Spanish arrived, Inca Emperor Atahualpa was in Cajamarca with 80,000 warriors. Leading this army was Francisco Pizarro, who had only 181 soldiers. Yes, you read that right. 181 soldiers were to face 80,000 men, but Pizarro was cunning and skilled in deceit. He knew that direct battle was impossible, so he devised a plan to trick the emperor. Pizarro sent a message to the emperor, saying he wished to meet him. Atahualpa, like the Aztec emperor, failed to understand the Spaniards' deceit, and arrived at Pizarro's camp with 5,000 unarmed guards, and he fell into the Spanish trap. Spanish soldiers hidden around the emperor's path were ready to strike at any moment. When the emperor arrived, Pizarro sent his priest Vicente to him. The priest told Atahualpa to accept Christianity and obey the Spanish king. Charles Atahualpa refused firmly. The priest returned to Pizarro and reported that the people would not submit. Pizarro ordered a massacre. In just 1 hour, Pizarro's small but agile force killed 4,000 innocent locals. The emperor was captured alive, and gold was demanded from him, enough to fill an entire room. But Atahualpa was not freed. Pizarro set a new condition. If the emperor accepted Christianity, he would receive pardon from the Spanish king. Atahualpa accepted Christianity to save his life, yet he was not spared. Historical sources state that the emperor was executed by strangulation. After the emperor's death, the Inca Empire met the same fate as the Aztecs. This great empire too fell under Spanish control. European powers' conquest of America afterward. Only 2 powers in the Americas could resist European invaders, the Aztecs and the Incas. But with their demise, there were no significant obstacles left for Europeans in the Americas. Within a few decades, territories from Mexico to Argentina came under Spanish rule. Portugal also established its hold over Brazil. Then, in 1606, a new chapter began. 3 British ships sailed toward North America, laying the foundation of a new state in this continent, which within a few centuries would become the world's sole superpower, the United States of America. When the people of England first set foot on this land, there was only one thing in their dreams: gold. In their minds, this world was like a lost treasure, where wealth was hidden beneath every stone. Some of them even came thinking that perhaps after taking just a few steps, they would find gold mines that would change their entire lives. But nature had something else in store for them. They did not find gold, but they did meet a personality whose age was only 10 years, yet whose decisions laid the foundation for an entire nation in the times to come. This girl is counted among the few figures in American history who, without any army or power, changed the course of events simply through her presence. Today, the beaches of Virginia attract thousands of tourists with their white and golden sand. But 500 years ago, this place lay deserted. People did live here, but far from the shore, in deep forests, along rivers, and in scattered villages. At that time, this area was under the influence of the Putan Confederacy, a strong alliance of more than 30 tribes. These tribes lived for miles in dozens of villages. They had their own forests, their own fields, their own language, and their own traditions. And in the heart of them lay that shore where history was about to take a new turn. In 1607, 3 British ships arrived at this shore. On board were 104 Englishmen, who had weapons, tools, and hopes. But they did not have the courage to face the reality and experience of the land. As soon as they landed, they went to a small area, surrounded on 3 sides by water. They found this place safe not because life was easy there, but because they were more concerned about protection from attacks. They established a colony and named it Jamestown in honor of their king. The river was also named James River. In the early days, the English pitched tents, built long wooden fences, and constructed a strong fort. The fort was triangular in shape, with a tall tower at each corner, each equipped with a cannon. Inside this small fort, they built a house, a grain warehouse, and a church. The English felt threatened from all sides, from Spain, and also from the local tribes, whom they mistakenly called Indians. But the real danger was not anyone. The real enemy was hunger. The land around Jamestown was marshy. Crops could not grow there, and living was not easy. Within a few days, food ran out. People started falling ill, and many died. The colony stood on the brink of destruction. It was at this time that, for the first time, the 10-year-old girl appeared on the scene. Pocahontas. Her real name was Matoka, but because of her playful nature, everyone called her Pocahontas. She was the daughter of the Powhatan King, the tiny princess of the Confederacy. Meanwhile, one day Jamestown's captain, John Smith, went into the forest with 2 companions. He ventured deep into the Powhatan tribe's territory, but 200 local warriors attacked him. Both of his companions were killed, and he was captured. The tribes brought him before the king. The king tried to understand a lot from Smith, but the language barrier left the conversation incomplete. Some misunderstandings occurred. Some fear arose. And then the king ordered, "Kill him." Smith's head was placed on a stone, and a large club was about to strike his skull when suddenly Pocahontas ran forward. She placed her head over Smith's. According to tradition, the king, faced with his daughter's insistence, changed his decision. John Smith's life was saved. After that, the king kept her for a while, treated her with hospitality, and then sent her back to Jamestown safely. Pocahontas often came to Jamestown carrying food, fruits, dried meat, and water. Because of her, the colony survived the famine crisis, giving the English a chance to stay alive. Time passed, and trade began. The tribes provided food, the English gave small tools, and thus, trust between the two grew. In the early days, there was a strange harmony between the Powhatan and the British settlers. The Native American tribes would bring grains, corn, fruits, and other food from the lands around their homes, and in return, the English would give them iron tools, small weapons, and everyday metal goods. For some time, this exchange was beneficial for both. It was as if a silent agreement existed, with neither enmity nor threat. But just as the end of a beautiful season suddenly comes, so too did this period of affection not last long. The hearts and needs of both peoples began to change. The real trouble began when the English of Jamestown increased their demand for food, but the Powhatan tribes themselves had little food, so where could they bring more to give? Virginia at that time was suffering from a severe famine. Rainfall was low, crops failed, and the forests seemed silent. In such a situation, the tribes had only enough grain to barely survive themselves. The question of extra food did not even arise. As food became scarce, smiles also diminished, and the friendship that had existed slowly began to fall apart. In this situation, John Smith made another attempt to manage the circumstances. At the beginning of 1609, he went to meet the Powhatan king. The meeting was very pleasant throughout the day. Conversations were held, food was eaten, everything seemed as before. But at night, Smith suddenly woke up. A faint sob reached his ears. He saw Pocahontas sitting next to him crying. In a trembling voice, she told him that her father had made a decision. By morning, Smith would be killed. The ground seemed to slip from under Smith's feet. This was the second time the young Powhatan princess had saved the life of an Englishman, or perhaps laid the foundation for a greater future that would shift the balance of power. Smith immediately woke his companions and escaped from there in the darkness of night. Pocahontas also sent a message to the people of Jamestown, and thus, dozens of lives were saved. Soon after, Smith was injured in an accident and sent back to England. Immediately after his departure, a new governor and more people arrived from England to Jamestown. The population began to increase. Conditions seemed to improve again. White settlers visited the tribes, witnessed their hospitality, and some even began living among them. But this was a time when most of the people coming from Europe were men. Women were very few, and the English settlers began to take wrongful advantage of this imbalance. Over time, attacks also began. Those who, frustrated by the lack of food, went to live among the tribes were called traders in Jamestown. If anyone was caught, they were often burned alive or subjected to painful punishments. Such incidents distanced the Powhatan family, especially Pocahontas, from Jamestown. And then came the time known in Jamestown's history as the Starving Time. The famine of 1609 had reached its peak. At the same time, 300 more people arrived from England, but they too had no food for themselves. Jamestown was already plagued by famine, dirty water, and disease. Now hundreds more hungry and thirsty people arrived. Winter was approaching. Harsh, merciless winters, the very mention of which filled people's eyes with fear. There was no game, no crops. The little food that existed was about to run out. In a few days, people began to die of hunger. Around 100 settlers perished. The children ate their pets, dogs, cats, even boiled leather shoes to fill their stomachs. But when even this ran out, humans began to walk a path that is horrifying to imagine. They dug up the graves of their dead companions, took out the corpses, cut the flesh, and ate it. When blood came out of the weak and half-dead, it was licked. It was a time when the instinct to survive outweighed humanity. Later, during excavations, experts found the bones of a 14-year-old girl. From the condition of her skull, it was clear that she too had been eaten during the days of famine. She was later given the name Jane, as a silent memorial of Jamestown's darkest period. The people who had fled Jamestown now began to take refuge with the Powhatan tribes, and soon they became part of their society. During the harsh winter of 1609, there were 500 English in Jamestown, but by the end of the winter, only 60 of them barely survived. Snow and hunger had completely gripped the settlement. As soon as the weather improved, these survivors headed toward the shore, where they saw ships approaching from a distance. These ships were coming from England and carried Jamestown's new governor, Lord de la Ware, along with 150 others. The ships were loaded with large amounts of food and water. For the settlers who were nearly dead from hunger, these ships were nothing less than heaven. Their hearts were filled with this good news, and a hope for a new life arose. Filled with hope for life, they returned to Jamestown, but the sight before them was horrifying. In 1610, when De La Ware stepped into the fort, the place was deserted and in ruins. The living looked like corpses. De La Ware immediately arranged for the supply of food, and also began preparations for action against the Powhatan Confederacy. His first demand was that the Powhatan return, the English who had fled during the starving time. But when the Powhatan refused, De La Ware sent a military detachment. The soldiers attacked a tribe, and whoever they found was mercilessly killed. The queen of the village and her 2 children were captured and sent by boat to Jamestown. On the way, the soldiers threw the children into the water and shot at them. The queen was brought to Jamestown to be burned alive, but the commander of the army felt pity and instead killed her with a dagger. It was clear that the Powhatan tribes could not remain silent in the face of such attacks. They could not openly attack the Jamestown fort because the British had cannons, but those who went outside the fort to the fields or for other work became easy targets. The supply of food was also cut off, forcing the British to seek a path of peace. The victory of peace negotiations came at the tip of the gun. The British kidnapped the Powhatan princess, Pocahontas. She was the same princess who had first given new life to Jamestown. With the help of a local chief, the girl was deceitfully placed on a British ship and became a hostage of the British. In 1613, Pocahontas was about 15 or 16 years old. After this abduction, the Powhatan Confederacy laid down their arms before the British, and the guerrilla warfare ended. The British forcibly converted Pocahontas to Christianity and gave her the name Rebecca. Later, she was married to an Englishman, John Rolfe. For the marriage, the ceremony formally sought permission from the girl's father, the Powhatan king, although in reality, he had no authority. Pocahontas revealed to the British a secret more valuable than gold or gold mines, the secret of tobacco cultivation. This secret would change English life in the coming centuries and lay the foundation for the establishment of a free America. Before Jamestown, the Spanish were growing tobacco in South America and selling it to Europe, holding a monopoly over it. A century later, this seed came into John Rolfe's hands, with whom Pocahontas was married. After the marriage, Pocahontas' knowledge and local agricultural skills produced the finest tobacco crops in Jamestown. Jamestown now began sending tobacco to England, ending Spain's monopoly. After the success of tobacco, people began coming from England and Europe to Jamestown to grow tobacco on the land. The colony transformed into a small town. In the first 11 years, there were only 100 women, who lived with their husbands or parents. As the number of men increased, the Virginia Company began regular commercial immigration of women. In 1619, about 90 women arrived in Jamestown and married settlers. Thus, families, farmhouses, domestic life, and tobacco fields grew together in the colony. The need for labor for these fields also increased, and the small settlement of Jamestown became a self-sufficient and profitable colony. The settlers could now establish farms on limitless lands as they wished, but the need for labor for these farms became a major problem. The solution to this problem was provided by an element that for centuries remained not only a necessity but also a problem for America, and even today is seen as a weakness in American history. This solution was African slaves. In 1619, a ship in Jamestown, with the help of a Dutch ship, captured a Portuguese ship carrying 50 black African slaves, including women and children. The farmers of Jamestown purchased 20 of these slaves, and thus began the 250-year period of slavery in America. The early settlers did not have much land, so they made small farms in their yards and backyards and began growing tobacco there. As the British population increased, they felt the need for new lands and took over the lands of the Powhatan Confederacy. Pocahontas, who had been the guarantor of peace between the British and the Native Americans, was no longer there. 3 or 4 years earlier, in 1616, Pocahontas had gone to England with her husband John Rolfe and their son. There, she received a grand reception at the royal court, was presented in Western attire, and given the Christian name Rebecca. This hospitality reflected how important the British government considered Pocahontas for the survival of Jamestown. But in 1617, during the return voyage to England, she fell ill and died at Gravesend, England. According to Native American tradition, her death was not natural but caused by poisoning. Pocahontas had become a legendary figure in history, inspiring many films and cartoons, including the 1995 animated film that depicted her in love with John Smith. Her death ended the era of peace between the British and the Powhatan Confederacy. Now the tribes were free and rose to defend their land. They began attacking new, unsecured British settlements around Jamestown. In one such attack in 1622, 377 British, including women and children, were killed, among them Pocahontas' husband John Rolfe. But this massacre did not stop colonization, and the British repeatedly defeated the tribes and seized their lands. In 1644, the Powhatan fought their final war for freedom against the British. It was a decisive battle in which 500 British and Europeans were killed, but the tribes lost and their king was killed. In 1646, the Powhatan surrendered, and the British enslaved them and took their lands under the name of peace. Thus, starting from the small settlement of Jamestown, the British, in just 29 years, had gained control over a large part of Virginia. The same English who once crowned the Powhatan king were now deprived of throne, crown, and land. Today, the remnants of this vast empire exist only in the 1,500-acre Pamunkey Reservation. Here, the stony likeness of Pocahontas' father is carved, and some of his descendants still live. Similar reservations exist for other tribes in America, whose lands were taken by the British, Americans, and Europeans. After conquering Virginia, Jamestown was destroyed in 1699 but was rebuilt as a memorial, attracting tourists from around the world. Here, the model ships on which the first settlers arrived are displayed, and statues of Pocahontas exist both in Jamestown and in England. This is the story of when the British first settled in Jamestown and laid the foundation for the future superpower, America. After initial success, Jamestown developed not just as a settlement but as a strong colony, which later became the center of the independence movement. This was the same colony that organized farm labor through slaves, grew tobacco on the lands, and ultimately laid the foundation of America. Today, we see that every corner of Jamestown, every story, every struggle, is part of the creation of a great nation that changed the course of history forever. You are watching the finest documentary of American history on Unlocked History Hub. Tap this playlist to begin the series and explore every fascinating moment of America's history. About 5 centuries ago, a British ship anchored in the cold coastal region of Massachusetts. There were about 100 passengers on this ship who settled a new colony near the shore, a colony they named Plymouth in memory of their homeland. Around this colony lay the same land where, for centuries, an ancient native tribe called Pekaniket had lived. One day, a man from this very tribe came among the new settlers of Plymouth, and surprisingly, he said in English, "Hello." This moment is still considered the most mysterious scene in American history. The question arises, how did that native man know the English language? And what is that historical secret that Americans have hidden from generations? What were those events that later shook the foundations of the American War of Independence? You are watching the final episode of Season 1 of Unlocked History Hub's History of America, where today we reveal the truth that has been hidden for centuries. Plymouth was, in fact, the second British colony in America. The first colony was established about 700 kilometers south of it, in Jamestown. The name Plymouth was chosen because the port in Britain, from where these people fled religious oppression, was also called Plymouth. Most of these passengers were followers of a particular religious sect, who were later called pilgrims, meaning those people who set out on a sacred journey for freedom of belief. Troubled by religious pressure, in 1620 they boarded a ship named Mayflower, undertook a long sea voyage, and after 65 days reached the shores of the New World in December 1620. Women, children, the elderly, all were with them. But no sooner had the colony been founded than hardships began to welcome them. The first trouble came from the weather, severe cold, icy winds, and wooden huts that were helpless. The second trouble was the land full of sand, where farming was almost impossible. The third trouble was death. A disease spread that within a few months wiped out nearly half of the settlers. These people were no longer capable of survival, and the last ray of hope was fading. But in those days, an event occurred which they believed to be a miracle. Near Plymouth lived a powerful tribe called Pekaniket. This tribe kept watching how these newcomers were suffering. One day, an influential man of the tribe, Samoset, reached Plymouth. He had learned the language from the English fishermen who had been coming to these coasts for centuries. That is why the word hello from his lips was nothing short of a marvel for the English settlers of that time. Samoset had actually come on a mission of help, but this help was conditional. The Pekaniket tribe wanted guns, gunpowder, weapons that could destroy their enemies. Their chief Massasoit contacted the English, and thus began a friendship built on needs. But the first need of the English was fertilizer, a method of farming. The native people told them that the secret of growing crops in sand was fish. Bury a dead fish in the soil and grow crops over it. The English adopted this method, and soon the barren land turned into fields of waving corn. This success was a moment to celebrate, but before celebrating, the English had to repay their promise to the Pekaniket. On the night of the 14th of August 1621, English and Pekaniket warriors attacked the village of an enemy tribe. Filled with bullets and gunpowder, this attack took dozens of native lives within moments. When they returned, a victory celebration was held, the same celebration which later came to be known as Thanksgiving. The celebration continued for 3 days. 50 English and 90 Native Americans, including Chief Massasoit, participated. The natives brought deer, wild fruit, and game. The English served turkey and their own dishes. But this truth is rarely written in the pages of American history. This celebration was held over the bodies of those who had been killed in that very attack. Time passed. The success of Plymouth pulled thousands of new settlers from England. The coasts of New England became crowded even in summer. And when the English gained power, their real face appeared, the plan to enslave the native people. In 1636, the war began that proved the English friendship was a deception. Only 15 years later, they targeted another large tribe, the Pequot. In this war, English commander John Mason brought devastation upon the native people, and the balance of power in North America changed forever. At the height of the Pequot War, English commander John Mason made a terrifying decision. He set fire to a large village of the Pequot tribe. About 700 people were trapped in the village: women, children, the sick, and the elderly. The fire surrounded the entire village within moments. People kept screaming, kept calling for help, but not a single English soldier felt mercy. Whoever tried to escape alive was shot and killed. When the flames of the village died down, the whole area was filled with burned bodies. Seeing this scene, John Mason said a sentence that is still considered a dark stain in American history. He said, "God is laughing at those who stood against the believers of God. God has turned them into a burning furnace." While counting the bodies, Mason called it God's just judgment. Another British commander, John Underhill, who participated in the massacre, tried to give religious justification for the killing of women and children. He said that religious books sometimes command that women and children also be killed along with their fathers. Instead of hiding this brutality, the British insisted on proving it legitimate. David Stannard, author of American Holocaust, writes that New England's religious leader Cotton Mather, in his book Magnalia Christi Americana, declared this slaughter a victory, writing, "In just 1 hour, 500 to 600 savages disappeared from the world, people who were a burden on the earth." This was their ideology, and it was these very beliefs that wiped out the existence of the Pequot tribe. The war continued for almost a year, and in the end, the Pequot nation was completely destroyed. Their villages were burned. Those who survived were tied with ropes and either thrown into the sea or sold as slaves. When this nation was wiped out, the English erased their name from the map as well. The river in Connecticut, that was called Pequot River, was renamed Thames River, and an entire town that was known as Pequot was turned into New London, and that name still exists today. But the destruction of the Pequot people was only the beginning. About 38 years later, another great war erupted, which extinguished the last hope of freedom for Native Americans. The same Pequeniket chief Massasoit, who had helped the Plymouth colony and participated in the first Thanksgiving, died in 1661. After his death, the fragile friendship between the English and the Pequeniket began to break. After Massasoit's death, his elder son became chief, and he abandoned his native name and adopted Alexander. Just as many natives of that era were forced to hide their identity and take English names. In 1662, the English accused Alexander of a conspiracy, arrested him, and tortured him. He died in an injured condition. Then his brother Metacom became chief, who changed his name to Philip, the same Philip who was later called King Philip. Philip tried every possible way for peace, but the English attitude had changed. They had begun to order the Pequenikets around. The Pequenikets were giving away their land in exchange for weapons, but in 1671, the English forced Philip to sign an agreement in which they had to return all the weapons they had already bought by selling their land. Now they had neither land, nor weapons, nor dignity left. Philip was no longer willing to tolerate humiliation. The interference of the English had increased so much that some Pequenikets had been converted to Christianity and assigned to espionage. In June 1675, one of these spies was found dead. The English blamed the Native Americans and hanged 3 men. This was the spark that ignited the war, and thus King Philip's War began. This war lasted from 1675 to 1676. For the Native Americans, this was the last war of freedom. Under Philip's leadership, the Pequeniket fought bravely, but they had almost no weapons. Most of the fighting was done with arrows, bows, and spears, while the English had gunpowder, guns, and allied tribes. The English began burning native settlements one after another. Seeing the settlements burning, religious leaders like Cotton Mather wrote about these scenes and called them barbecues. Some tribes sided with the English, and along with them, the last resistance of the Pequenikets was crushed. Philip's family was captured first. His wife and his 9-year-old son were enslaved. And finally, in August 1676, news arrived that Philip was present in his ancestral region. The English, along with their native allies, launched an attack. Philip resisted until the end, but was killed while fighting. The tragic thing is that the man who killed him was a member of his own tribe, who had become a Christian and was now part of the English army. Even after Philip's death, the English did not stop humiliating him. His body was cut into pieces and burned. His hands were given to the killer as a reward. One hand he sold, and the other he kept as a souvenir. Philip's head was brought to Plymouth and placed on a spear outside the gate of the settlement. His head hung there for 25 years. The skull of New England's last king became a spectacle for people to see. After Philip's death, the English celebrated because the last major defense of the Native Americans in New England had come to an end. In that era, when August 13th was declared a day of Thanksgiving, another story was also buried in the background. King Philip, whose father had cooperated with the British, and the man who had taught them the skill of growing vegetables in these lands, is today remembered in Massachusetts through his statue, right where he once ruled. But behind this tradition of Thanksgiving was also a dark chapter, which Americans today prefer to hide from their new generation. With time, Thanksgiving Day became a traditional festival, which is now celebrated on the last Thursday of November. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln declared this day a national holiday, and this tradition continues to this day. But for the present native tribes of America, this day is not joy, but a memorial of sorrow, a national day of mourning. After King Philip's devastating war, the English had established complete control over New England. The Native Americans, deprived of their lands, were confined to limited regions. Meanwhile, settlers coming from Europe were rapidly spreading across America's coastal areas. The environment of America was so favorable for them that the average height of the coming generations increased by up to 2 inches. Every household was having an average of 8 children, and no power existed that could stop this growing population. Thus, the settlers multiplied to such an extent that today 1 out of every 10 Americans is connected to their bloodline. The Plymouth colony became like a seed, from which within just 1 century, 13 English colonies sprouted along the American coast. During this time, France was also occupying vast regions. Much of present-day America and Canada was under its influence. Meanwhile, Spain had established its colony in Florida. The way these powers fought in Europe, similar confrontations were happening in their colonial territories as well. This struggle for borders and power took the shape of a major war in 1756. The Native American tribes also joined their preferred European powers, seeing opportunity and advantage. A local military force of the British colonies, known as the Colonial Militia, was also part of this war. Among these soldiers was a young officer, George Washington, who would later become the greatest figure in American history. Eventually, the European wars were settled in 1763 through the Treaty of Paris. France had to withdraw from America and Canada. All French territories of Canada went to Britain. While the French regions of America were divided between Spain and Britain, British control over Florida was also formally recognized. The lands of the Native Americans, which were still autonomous, now came under British control. Thus, British power expanded from the 13 colonies to the entire region. This was the most powerful era of British rule in America. But immediately after the 7 Years' War, the British Empire made 2 such mistakes that shook the foundations of this entire power. The first mistake: to compensate for the financial losses of the war, Britain imposed new taxes on the American colonies, especially a heavy tax on tea. But taxation without representation was unacceptable to the Americans. The second mistake: entry of European settlers into the territories gained from France was prohibited. These regions were reserved only for Native Americans, the Red Indians. Furthermore, the settlers who lived near these regions were forcibly relocated elsewhere. The burden of taxes, and the eviction of settlers in the name of protecting native lands. These 2 decisions became the seeds of anger and rebellion in the American colonies. The rebellion began in Boston, about 70 kilometers from Plymouth. Then a painting was published in an American newspaper, an image that transformed sparks of protest into burning flames. This very scene later laid the foundation of a new nation, the United States of America. How did all this happen? Why did the attempt to benefit the East India Company become a loss for Britain instead? What was that party which changed the map of the world? You will see all of this in Season 2, Episode 1 of the History of America. Friends, with this episode, Season 1 of America's history comes to its completion. How did you find this season? Do share your feedback. Season 2 will be in front of you very soon. To watch all episodes of Season 1, from the discovery of America to the brink of independence, tap here. And here see the unbelievable true stories of our universe.